Hello and welcome to another edition of Entheoradio, where we talk about shamanism, psychedelics, and altered states for healing. This is your host, Captain Hugh T. Alkemi, also known as Travar. I'm very, very happy today to welcome a very special and important guest, Dr. Rick Strassman. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Trevor, for having me.
And here's Rick's bio. Rick Strassman is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Foundation. From 1990 to 1995, he performed the first new human studies with psychedelic drugs in the United States in more than 20 years, focusing on the powerful naturally occurring compound DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. He is the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and the co-author of Inner Paths to Outer Space. He lives in Gallup, New Mexico. You still in Gallup?
I still am in Gallup,
where
it's wet and soggy everywhere.
Good. It's wet here in San Diego, too. Do you guys get any snow up there?
We get a lot of snow. It gets cold here. It's pretty close to the Continental Divide at around 7,000 feet.
Okay,
So we've already had a low one morning of 1 above Fahrenheit.
Wow. That's a little low for me. I'm happy to be in San Diego.
Well, you know, I did my fellowship at UC San Diego.
Oh, did you?
La Jolla, VA. I lived in Pacific Beach for a year, and I just loved it there.
It's a whole nother realm, and yeah, PB, that little coastal town. Yeah, it's pretty well known if you're in California, if you're going up and down the coast, and yeah, everyone gets to live in the coastal town, San Diego, once in a while, and it's a vibe for sure. So.
Well, you know, one of my mentors at UCSD characterized San Diego in a really succinct manner. He said, everyone's beautiful in San Diego.
That's a good way of thinking about it. I have often sparred with people about that because I've lived in Las Vegas and Las Vegas tries, but San Diego, everyone's pretty active. They're all beach bodies. They're all outdoors, and it's all good weather all year round, pretty much.
Well, you know, I learned how to do clinical psychopharmacology at UC San Diego. You know,
Okay.
Giving experimental drugs in a scientific setting. Collecting samples, giving rating scales, analyzing data. So that was a formative year and helped me formulate and perform the clinical research that I did with both melatonin and with DMT later.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. So when you talk about your work, did you start off with lab rats and animals and then work your way up to humans, or were there always human volunteers for these hallucinogenic tryptamines?
Well, in college, I did some lab research with chicken embryos, but that gave me bad dreams, and I didn't like being cloistered in a lab like that. So I quickly decided in my early 20s I wanted to do human work or human research. So that was pretty much it with the melatonin work, and the psychedelic work was normal volunteers. We never studied patients, people with depression or PTSD, those kinds of things. It was just normal volunteers.
Yeah, and your study took place so early on. I mean, I started hearing about psychedelic research in maybe 2008, 2009, and your study predates that a long time.
Yeah, we gave our first dose of DMT in late 1990, and we wrapped up in September 95. So it wasn't until quite a few years that the field got some traction and some greater visibility, maybe 10 years.
That's amazing. And how did people feel about you doing that work when you told them about doing that work in the early 90s?
Well, you know, it was a complicated time. I mean, that was the era of the first George Bush.
Hmm.
Um, the war on drugs was pretty hot and heavy. Uh, but I had established my credentials as a clinical researcher at UNM in Albuquerque. And when the melatonin study didn't turn out to establish melatonin as especially psychoactive, I decided to study DMT instead. And when I, you know, told the people in the department and the research center that I wanted to change fields and go into psychedelic, drug research, they, it was, it was so far off the radar. I mean, people had basically forgotten about psychedelic drugs. Uh, One of the administrators for the research unit, an endocrinologist, used to joke about us smoking mushrooms back there. So that was, the level of sophistication that was, circulating at the time about psychedelic drugs. So they, basically said, if that's what you want to do, you've got a track record that you've established, you've published, you've gotten grants, you've been to meetings. So if this is what you want to do, do it. Be careful, stay out of the newspaper, and we'll support you. Um, so locally, at the university and the New Mexico setting, it was pretty supported. The government in Washington, DEA and FDA, presented some more obstacles from a regulatory point of view. My colleagues, or my scientific colleagues, like the ones I might go to meetings with, were well, it would depend on the generation. Some of the older researchers that have cut their teeth on human psychedelic drug research in the 60s would come up to my DMT poster and say, "Oh, we thought that was like way in history," or they'd say, "It's deja vu all over again," or weren't those theories debunked? So the older generation was skeptical or bemused. The younger generation of researchers were both curious and a little afraid. Like they didn't know much about psychedelics, but they knew that psychiatry research had gotten a black eye over their study previously. So they were kind of tentatively interested, like oh wow, this is interesting, but it's going to ruin your career, isn't it? So yeah, it was a very complicated set of cultural and political, historical streams kind of meeting at that time.
Interesting. And give me a common thing that they would say. Maybe you would pass somebody in the hall, and maybe you'd even start a conversation with a new person, and you start off with the topic of "this is what I'm doing." What was one of the most common turn of phrases they would use?
um, I never told people what I was doing. I really kept it to myself. Um,
Interesting.
when people would ask me what I do, I would say I work at the University of New Mexico, and I would try to change the topic, and then they'd say, well, what do you do there? And I say, well, I'm a psychiatrist, and I work in the department there. And they might say, well, what do you do there? And I'd say, I teach, do research, and see patients. So I would make it extremely difficult for to kind of jump right into it. But at the same time, I was recruiting volunteers. So depending on who the person was and their level of sophistication with drugs, psychedelics, I would I would immediately start talking about the study and whether they might be interested in participating.
How interesting. So I'm going to ask you some real off-cuff questions, and you can bypass them and you will not offend me. So why dimethyltryptamine? Why intravenous DMT versus mescaline, LSD, or psilocybin? Why that one?
Well, at least a couple of reasons. Um, One was that it was obscure. It was relatively obscure. And I knew if the media found out about our work, uh, that there would be, less of a stir if we weren't studying LSD, which, attained a pretty nefarious reputation within scientific, public, and political circles. Um, yeah, so it was obscure. Terence McKenna had just started his uh, discussions of DMT, but it was still, rather early. I don't think many of our volunteers even knew about Terence at the time. Um, it was, short acting. Uh, when it's smoked, it begins working within a heartbeat or two, peaks in 2 or 3 minutes, and people are down by half hour, 40 minutes or so. So I knew the studies would have to take place in a really clinical environment. We, wanted to frame the work in as conservative and meat and potatoes clinical research,
Yeah.
context as possible. So the study would occur on a research unit with cancer patients getting experimental chemotherapy, diabetes research where people were going into hypoglycemia, so it was going to be a harsh environment, or potentially. And I thought if people had bad trips because of the environment, they'd be short-lived, as opposed to 6 hours, 8 hours, 10
Right.
hours, even 12 with mescaline.
Yeah.
Um, and from the scientific point of view, there were a lot of interesting unanswered questions about DMT. It's endogenous. It's made in the human body, and one wonders, what it's doing there. It's also an abused drug and could be seen as the model or the simplest of the tryptamine compounds. And the more we understood about DMT, we could extrapolate to other drugs like psilocybin or LSD, which are tryptamine-like.
Yes.
So there were drug abuse questions, psychosis questions because of endogenous DMT. Is it being overproduced in schizophrenics, let's say, and uh, clinical reasons. It was short-lived, and political ones. It's a relative lack of notoriety.
Yeah. That's a really great and well thought through answer. And it seems like that might even have been in your first book. Yeah, that's in the first book.
Yeah, so that's in the spirit molecule, DMT, the spirit molecule, and it was also in my grant applications
Okay.
because I needed to be as upfront as I could be about what the risks were, what the important questions were. Um, Even though I had ulterior, theological questions, it was a straight ahead psychopharmacology study, funded by the war on drugs, uh, you know, and being very, closely watched by FDA and the DEA. It was the first one of its kind in so long. So yeah, I really, it was really important to be extraordinarily straightforward and honest and, intelligent about it.
Beautiful. I think you play that part very well. And you are definitely one of the most prestigious and well-known people that have been on Entheoradio. So when did that book come out? The notoriety came much later, right? The first book in your series was closer to 2000?
Yeah, it came out, I think, January 2001.
Okay.
So it's been out yeah, I think, yeah, it was January 2001. I was in Taos at the time. Yeah, it's done quite well, that book. 193,000 copies have sold. It's been translated into 13 or 14 languages.
Wow.
Plus it's, the basis of the, documentary by the same name, DMT, the spirit molecule,
Yes.
which has been incredibly successful and well received.
Yeah, that documentary really did popularize the subject and the substance, the molecule itself. I think I would say the ball has been moved forward by your work and your authorship, maybe more so than Terence McKenna.
Well, I think from the point of view of, research, especially clinical or human research, yeah, our work at UNM clearly established it could be done and how to do it.
Beautiful, beautiful. So what was it like for you to bring and then the movie came out, what, close to 2012, 10 years after the book? First book?
Oh, man. I think either 2011 or 2012. We began to film in January 2007.
Wow.
In Albuquerque, our first set of interviews, and then in Berkeley a few months later in 2007, then New York in 2008, and then there was a dry spell with respect to funding, and we didn't pick up again for another year or two, and finished our interviews in New York again. Yeah, so I think it came out, I think we finished interviewing in 2009, and I think it came out 2 years later.
Okay. Beautiful. Yeah, that I've probably watched that movie twice, and I've told dozens of people about it.
Oh, thanks. Well, I've watched that film 13 times, and
Nice.
it's really jam-packed, full of information and ideas and concepts. Yeah, and it's really great, visual imagery. But I always pick up at least one new thing with every viewing, even after watching it 13 times.
Were you able to see the most recent showings of Fantastic Fungi in the theaters? I know that's a recent film where they talk about psilocybin pretty openly.
No, I haven't seen it. It's playing in Albuquerque, I think this week at the Guild Theater. So if you're in the Southwest, New Mexico, go see Fantastic Fungi at the Guild Theater. I think it's the 11th and 13th, perhaps. But it is this week, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, one of my favorite, most recent documentaries to have come out. And I had the privilege of sitting, 10 feet away from Paul Stamets and then interacting with him with a microphone, asking questions. So it was pretty cool. It came to town in San Diego about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Paul Stamets deserves a Nobel Prize.
He's definitely up there amongst the people that have moved ecology and plant medicines forward, and our human potential movement. He's they call it not a bioengineer, maybe it's a bioneer. Yeah, the bioneer kind of thing.
A pioneer, yeah.
So this is the most recent copy. For those who can see the video, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. This is the most recent edition of the DMT series, Rick, right?
Well, I've never, considered it a series, but that's an interesting idea because each of them, uh, uh, well, because each of them, deals, with DMT, and it's an evolving story for sure. Um, but still, I think, or I've, up until now, I've thought of the prophetic states, book as a standalone item. I review the DMT work in the first quarter, first 20% of the prophetic states book, but then move on to a top-down model of the prophetic experience, which involves DMT.
Right. And you're talking about this book, right? When you say prophetic states, the soul of prophecy.
Yeah, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. The title's interesting. I just wanted to call it the Soul of Prophecy because even though DMT plays a role, I believe, in the prophetic state, the soul of prophecy, the information, it's fundamental and essential characteristics, don't have anything to do with drugs. They're more, or even the brain in a way. It's the information that's contained in the text uh, is the soul of prophetic experience. But my publisher, who's got the final say when it comes to the title of any book, said, DMT sells. So DMT is going to be in the title if you,
Yeah.
if you like it or not. So it's been a mixed bag. I mean, people, it's true, DMT sells. But at the same time, I've always wanted to kind of extend my reach beyond the solely psychedelic community into those who might be interested in prophecy and the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And that's occurring. It's like it's a slow process. That book is the end result of 18 years of work, and in some ways, I'm more proud of it than the original DMT book, The Spirit Molecule, because I had to learn a whole new discipline and a way of thinking about reality, as opposed to the first DMT book, which in a way is a collection of bedside notes with preface and an afterword. But this book about prophecy required learning the Hebrew Bible to the best of my ability. So that was a pretty big challenge
It is.
for an older guy, even in my 40s.
Well, they say what you have to be over 30 something to study Kabbalah, right? Or you'll go insane.
That's yeah. Well, you need to be married, and you need to be at least 40 years old.
Okay. Yeah. Married in 40. Yeah. Maybe I studied Kabbalah a little too young, and then that's why I'm a little bit weird.
Well, what do you make of the requirement to be married?
Um, I think that basically means monogamy. I think that means as I mean, well, you can give me more detail, and I'm open to being reinterpretive. But I feel it has to do with learning to deepen into love and relationship with one person, and learning to see that person more clearly, the way that they talk about in the tantric and ascetic forms of yoga. Maybe, I mean, what do you think?
Well, yeah, um, I think those are true reasons. I think that's right. I think at a more practical, everyday level, if you're married, your spouse keeps on knocking you off the pedestal if she's worth her weight,
Mhm.
or worth her salt. Take out the garbage. Why do you think you're so smart? Or why do you think um, you're so privileged? They keep you from overweening pride, which I think is one of the dangers of exalted states of consciousness of any sort, with drugs, or those occurring within the setting of a religious community, or a religious tradition.
Absolutely. I actually I agree with you there, and I'm sad that I overlooked that. But yeah, the daily practice of relationship and humbleness. Yes, absolutely. Have you? I mean, I'm not sure if this is on topic or if it's too personal. Have you practiced gematria in the middle of the night, like it's recommended sometimes, or the doing of resuscitation of words and the spellings of words from the Hebrew traditions?
No, no. To be honest, I've avoided Kabbalah, both the study and the practice. It just seems a bit too complicated, and the practices, they're a bit on the magical side.
Yeah.
So I'm a little cautious about magical practice. Not because it isn't effective or it doesn't work, but because it does. So you really have to know what you're doing and why, and what your intent is. So I've just focused on the text, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Yeah, so I study the Hebrew Bible every day. And there's a huge number of commentators who began writing commentaries on the text thousands of years ago, at around the time of the compilation of the Hebrew Bible.
Hmm.
And that tradition of writing commentaries continues. So I'm reading the Torah once a year, the whole thing, and I try to have a new commentary open that year. Yeah, so there's been a lot written about the Hebrew Bible. I could show you my bookshelves, which is about 2/3
Oh
of
wow,
what I've got.
that's a library. That's a study right there.
Yeah, and that's all the Hebrew Bible. It's all things that are written about, or because of the Hebrew Bible.
Wow. Yeah. So, in a recent interview with Graham Hancock, you discussed how you started, um, maybe not as faithful in the Jewish tradition. Well, you started with it as you were brought up, and then you moved away from it and moved towards Zen Buddhism for a while. Is that right? Am I getting the timeline correct on that?
Yeah, I was born and raised in a conservative Jewish community and household, family. Yeah, I was bar mitzvahed when I was 13. We never really touched upon spiritual issues to any extent
Hmm.
in the 6 hours per week Hebrew school that was supplemental to my public school education,
Okay.
which I did from 5 years old until I was 13. We learned some Hebrew, we learned some Bible, we learned about Israel, the festivals, folk dancing. I was a member of the folk dancing squad, and that was ecstatic. But we never talked about the ecstasy as kids. I mean, it was
Huh.
fun, and it was great to perform. But the spinning and the clapping and the keeping time with other group of people, with the audience screaming, yeah, it's an altered state. But we never obviously discussed the altered state that all of us were in. um, yeah, so I had to look elsewhere for satisfying my curiosity in altered states, and that began with transcendental meditation, and then I learned about Buddhism, and then started a more earnest practice and study in my early 20s. And that kind of wrapped up, or at least my relationship with the larger monastic or the larger monastic community kind of wound down maybe 23 years ago or so.
Okay.
But I was in it pretty deep for over 20 years. I was married at the monastery and co-founded and helped lead an affiliated meditation group for years and years. So it was the spiritual practice and community which I relied upon. So once the formal relationship with that community wrapped up, I was free to begin looking at the Jewish tradition, and I was also interested in Judaism because I had an inkling that its form of spiritual understanding was more relevant to the DMT effect. The Buddhist model characterized the visions and the voices as, by and large, kind of delusional in a way, or superficial. They were, not what you were looking for. They were essentially unreal phenomena. And one of the hallmarks of the DMT effect is its convincingly real quality. People come back saying it feels more real than real. So the Zen Buddhist approach, to the altered state brought on by DMT didn't quite valence the reality quality to the extent that seemed to be the case in the minds of the volunteers. In addition, the peak effect of DMT was quite full of content, quite interactive, quite relational. And I was expecting from my study of Zen Buddhism, that the peak effect of the DMT state would be a formless, content-free, ego-dissolving kind of an effect. And that wasn't what the DMT volunteers described. In which case they maintained their sense of self and identity. They could interact with things voluntarily. It was quite emotional, either positive or negative. So that wasn't consistent with the Zen Kensho prototype. So I began studying the Hebrew Bible as the basis of Jewish belief, and the notion of a prophetic state with a overlapping phenomenology with the DMT experience began to take shape.
That's beautiful. And so what gave you, so other than your upbringing, was there some other intuitive push towards studying the Hebrew Bible to determine, to seek these endogenous and or exogenous altered states in the scriptures?
Well, there were a couple of things about the DMT reports that I couldn't quite work through while I was doing this study, and I needed a lot of time to think about it afterwards. One of the features was the reality basis, or the reality sensation, which we just talked about.
Yeah.
And the other is what seemed to be the inhabited quality of the DMT space. It seemed to be inhabited by some intelligence. It could be discerned as discrete objects, the so-called beings, who are intelligent and they're powerful and they interact with you in this world of light that's the DMT world. Or else the intelligence or the sentience was more diffused in the space itself. The colors, let's say, the pulsating experience.
Yeah.
But still, it felt inhabited. So even though I expected it in a way, it still surprised me with how frequent it was, how compelling it was, how utterly strange it was. So those were the two most puzzling features of the DMT experience. So I just wasn't happy with any of the models for those two attributes that I had previously brought to bear on the work. The psychopharmacology model seemed kind of soulless in a way. This is your brain on drugs.
Yeah.
Which is true. I mean, obviously, it's your brain, it's on drugs, but what is really going on? So why is the brain configured that way? That when you give this drug, it happens to cause these experiences. What's the value there? Why is it designed that way? So I also, brought to bear the psychoanalytic perspective. Like all the visions and the voices were symbolic of something else. They represented unconscious impulses or drives or conflicts. I mean, even repressed memories. Still, they were residing in the mind, and well, no, that's a bit off track. Yeah, well, I'll just leave it with regard to the unconscious drives and conflicts.
Okay.
I started to look at quantum physics, parallel universes, dark matter. Perhaps DMT modified the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex and allowed you to see levels of the physical world which are normally invisible, like a telescope or a spectrometer or a microscope. But even so, even if that were true, which is a which is a huge leap, it still really didn't address the more fundamental question. Why are things designed that way? If DMT provides access to usually invisible layers of the physical universe, why? What is the value or the the meaning behind that configuration, that mechanism of action? So I started to look for more theological religious streams of thought which address altered states, but also have worked more consistently over a longer period of time to extract information from those states, the specific ideas, specific guidelines for behavior. So I had pretty much maxed out on the Zen model for the reasons we already spoke about. Shamanism, I just don't know that much about, and it seemed as if there were a lot of moral and ethical baggage problems with shamanism. It's a lot of black magic and spiritual warfare. Yeah, it seemed kind of dark, and I was starting to think, well, I'm a Westerner. I write to mostly Western audience, and isn't there Western tradition, and obviously being raised Jewish and having some familiarity with the Hebrew Bible, that was a natural place to begin looking for number one, a Western model, and number two, one that was more compatible with the descriptions from the DMT volunteers.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna ask you kind of anatomy physiology question, and then I'm gonna segue into the brain chemistry and possibly the anatomy of those people that lived long ago in the time of the Hebrew Bible. So the first question is,
That
go ahead.
so this might be a good time to take a break. Maybe I'll hit the bathroom and get some more water.
Okay, let me pause that. And so I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about the places in the body that endogenous DMT is produced, and where we're digesting that, where it's being uptaken into our system. As something I'm sure this is a very basic question. For some people listening, maybe this is their first exposure to DMT, and I think I've heard within my community a lot of argument about whether it's coming from the pineal gland in the head or it's coming from the lungs through breathing and exercising of transformational breathing exercises, pranayams, that sort of thing.
Well, first, we can state that there are hundreds of plants, if not thousands, which contain DMT. Sponges, fish, maybe. So it's pretty widespread in the natural world. So DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, and bufotenine were discovered in mammalian tissues in the rabbit and the rat. I think mostly the rabbit in the early 1960s. And then those compounds were discovered in human tissues, blood, urine, and spinal fluid.
Oh,
wow. So people have wondered, where is that DMT made? For a number of years, maybe just until the last 10 years or so, 15 years, the standard or the widespread belief was that the lungs made DMT. The concentration of the enzymes responsible for DMT synthesis are quite high in the lungs. Levels of DMT were determined to be high in the lungs. But the data, the more recent genetic data, genes, DNA, enzymes, are all pointing towards the brain area, the brain itself. In my DMT book, The Spirit Molecule, I bring to examine a lot of older studies which pointed to the possibility of the pineal gland making DMT. And because of the religious significance of the pineal gland throughout history, it would be an amazing coincidence if there were some biological correlate of the experience of an inner light in the middle of the head resulting from prayer or from meditation. And a group in Ann Arbor, Jimo Borjigian, in their neuroscience department, published a paper in 2013 which reported measurable levels of DMT in the living rodent pineal gland. So that was a confirmatory finding, that indeed there was DMT in the pineal.
Yeah.
But the same group in Ann Arbor has continued looking at DMT in the brain, the pineal gland, and the same lab, same laboratory published a paper a few months back, which demonstrated DMT synthesis in the rodent brain, and the previous study, which suggested DMT was in the pineal, was a spurious finding resulting from the probe being poked through the brain into the pineal gland in that earlier study, measuring DMT in the the brain tissue which was collected inadvertently at the same time.
Okay.
So at least with this new study, there isn't the evidence that the pineal makes DMT. But what is even more important, I think, way beyond the silver lining, it's the silver body is that the concentrations of DMT in the brain are almost as high or are in the same ballpark quantity as well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin and like dopamine.
Okay.
So that begins to get you thinking about a DMT neurotransmitter system in the mammalian brain, which would be a very strange thing. So that's where that group is heading to, look at, the DMT mechanism, machinery in the mammal.
Interesting. So then we apply this information that we know, maybe a little bit about those studies in modern times on rodents and mammals and humans, to what may have been with the Hebrew people at the time when the stories were being told. Perhaps there was a different biome inside the gut. Maybe they had a different amount of oxygen on the planet, or maybe they had certain practices that allowed them to have these mystical, I'm going to call them mystical experiences. What do you theorize?
One more thing to wrap up the endogenous DMT story. Yeah, well, so Borgigian's group reported that brain levels of DMT increase markedly after cardiac arrest in a rodent. The concentrations go up by at least a factor of 5, I think, or 8 times. Significant increase of brain DMT in the dying animal. So that I think is another piece in the puzzle of understanding the biology of the near-death state.
Yes, yes. Oh, I have so many follow-ups to that. So questions that are tabled. Tell me about, because I really want this interview to be focused on some of these stories in the Hebrew Bible, and I've had such a great time interfacing with scholarly Jewish peoples about your book in the last 2-3 weeks since we've talked and leading up to this interview. So tell me what you think about the time, the biome and the microbiome, and then the the food and the set and setting that these people were living in, and maybe that can help us to discover a little bit more about DMT endogenous or exogenous.
Yeah. Well, we don't really know any way to increase endogenous DMT synthesis. So I think, the idea that you could, do something, or there was, something in your physical environment that might raise endogenous levels of DMT, it would be hard to imagine right now anyway. I think as we learn more about what regulates and levels of endogenous DMT, we could then look backwards at whether those circumstances were existent in ancient times. So those are all what you would consider bottom up ways of increasing endogenous DMT, theoretically. The top-down model, which is the one I ultimately introduce in the Prophetic States book, is a top-down model wherein God, in order to communicate with humans, is the one who stimulates endogenous DMT through the outpouring or overflowing or emanation of divine energy, downwards into the human brain. So it's, I guess, as it were, an increase of, DMT from above, as opposed to from below. They both, theoretically, DMT in the brain is DMT in the brain. So what it's doing. Pharmacologically would be indistinguishable between those two cases. And that in a way is a good springboard to discuss the Prophetic States book and what prompted me to write it.
You tell.
Well, as we were discussing earlier, I was looking for a better model, and began thinking about the prophetic state as a model. And my intuition was that the descriptions of the two experiences were quite similar, phenomenologically. The visions and the voices, the emotions, the body sensations, those are all reported in the Hebrew Bible in people experiencing, what I call prophetic consciousness, which is any altered state in the Hebrew Bible. It isn't just foretelling or predicting, it's any spiritual experience. Seeing God or angels flying through space, seeing things. If you read, chapter 1 of Ezekiel, it is a completely, carbon copy of a big DMT trip. He falls down, he hears roaring waters. There's a blue, firmament above his head. He's yanked by the hair, by an angel, taken through space. He's, fearful. He's freaking out. The visions, spinning wheels and angels with eyes on their wings.
Yes.
Yeah, this was all written like a long, long time ago, and there isn't any mention of drugs. So you have got to think that there was, something going on in his, brain, which was mediating at least the experiences that he described. So the descriptions of the two states were quite similar, and I compared the prophetic experiences with those of my DMT volunteers and found an extremely high correspondence. But still, the DMT state doesn't have the impact on the larger culture, let's say, as the prophetic, the prophetic experiences. Everybody knows about Moses and Abraham and Daniel and David, Jacob and Abraham and Isaac. They all had prophetic communication with the divine. So the content of the message of those people who underwent those DMT-like experiences are obviously more rich. The information is more enduring, more impactful. Like if you look at Western civilization, which is the dominant civilization, for better or for worse, in a lot of ways, it's based on notions and practices which were first laid down in the Hebrew Bible. The economy, philosophy, morality, politics, theology. All of those are basically derivatives or stand on ideas which are contained in the Hebrew Bible, as compared to the volunteers in the study who may have been convinced of the truth of certain things they believed before but weren't quite sure, or they received some personal healing, let's say. They were quite limited in scope. So obviously, either the information in the two states is very different, or the ability of the person having the experience to extract information from that state or those states is quite different. So I began to look at, well, what is the message of the Hebrew Bible? And that, I think, is the soul of prophecy. If you look at the Hebrew Bible as a prophetic text, one that was received and collated and transmitted under the umbrella of the prophetic state, then the whole text is a prophetic text. And oh God, where was I taking this?
Hmm. Take your
Yeah,
time.
you know, so, oh, yes, the soul of prophecy is is the information which is received and communicated from that state.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the information that is transmitted by the prophets as compared to transmitted by the volunteers, and it's a fairly simple message. It's got two parts. One has to do with belief, and the other has to do with action. The belief is of one God, which precludes idolatry or paganism or idol worship.
Okay.
And the behavioral, the behavioral statement, I guess, is the golden rule. The golden rule. To love your to love your fellow as yourself.
Right. Right. I think my grandfather said it was do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a pretty common way, I think.
No,
No?
that's not the golden rule.
Ah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very yeah. Well, doing unto others as you want unto you. I mean, that's really narcissistic,
I see. I see.
self-centered,
I see. You're using
result-oriented.
love others.
Yeah, it
Love
isn't that
yourself.
spirit. It's a zero. It's a zero sum. Uh, recontextualization of the golden rule.
I
The
see.
golden rule, as stated in Leviticus, is love your fellow as yourself. Love your fellow as much as you love yourself, which is a lot more sophisticated and doesn't have to do with any self serving
Okay. Okay.
purposes.
I'm going to reframe that entire conversation that I remember with my grandfather so that it fits that golden rule more appropriately. And I appreciate the reframe because that to me that elevates consciousness so much more to incorporate love and self-love and others.
It's a much more expansive perspective on that idea. Exactly.
Beautiful.
It's a spiritual one. It's a spiritual one. It isn't a psychological one.
Right. Yeah. I can't say that he was a spiritual person or a religious person because I think he had some difficulty moving through grief that he experienced with his mother dying when he was very young. So yeah, some people cope with it in different ways, and I suppose that might have been how he did that, the do unto others sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. You do things for any number of reasons. One is to avoid pain, and to obtain pleasure. So that more primitive, but still it's an effective motto, I guess, or saying. It's self-protective. It helps other people. Yeah, but it's more of a psychological or sociological take as opposed to more elevated one, like self-love. Like you're talking about. It's key. Like if you love yourself, you know what it's like to love. You know how it feels to be loved. Yeah, so you've got that available to you that you may not otherwise have, which you can then share if you're so inclined.
Beautiful, beautiful, well said. And I love how you made it seem like we have choice, and I think throughout the biblical scriptures there's a big component of choice offered.
Well, it's just this historical, linear, narrative of the choices made by mankind since creation. Every effect has got preceding causes, and yeah, it's quite a timeline. Yeah, so it's assumed that people are able to choose, and the text is a record what happens with those choices, what those choices are. Yeah, these are theological ideas, which the psychological, or which the psychedelic community as a whole, I don't think has taken a very sophisticated approach to.
No.
Right, right now it's kind of a hodgepodge of New Age, shamanism, evangelical Christianity. Um, yeah, it isn't especially well articulated, and I think that's one of the boons of a text and a tradition like the Hebrew Bible, is that it deals with experiences which share many features with the psychedelic state, but at the same time, it's not the experiences which are important, but the information which they receive in those experiences and communicate, to the larger community. So I think as a framework which incorporates the idea of one God and the golden rule, those are concepts which are really shown a spotlight upon to understand in the text and in the writings. So if somebody is looking for a spiritual scaffolding within which to, or upon which to stand when you're tripping, let's say, there are
Okay.
examples in the text of people in prophetic states asking angels and God to clarify, to explain, to argue with. So those kinds of narratives can provide some guidance. If you're, let's say, tripping on ayahuasca and you encounter a being, what do you ask it, and how do you ask it, and how do you know it's telling you the truth, and how do you remember it and communicate it, and if you need help understanding it, what do you do? So all that is spelled out in the text, and the prophetic text, like Abraham has questions, or he's got a request, or yeah, it's just kind of laid down in very practical terms that you can learn from, I think, and then take into the psychedelic state.
Beautiful. And I think most of your books, the layout, at least the DMT series books, The Spirit Molecule and The Soul of Prophecy, these tend to be a little bit more instruction manuals and like journalistic books versus like novels. And they're really easy to read. So if our listeners are looking to pick up a book for the holidays, I highly recommend this. Hanukkah's coming up. I gave one as a Hanukkah gift to a friend.
What do your Jewish friends think of this idea?
Well,
Theoneurology, God's overflowing into our brains, and DMT, and then visions.
so I have, let's see, I have like 5 Jewish friends here in San Diego, and I can think of at least 2 of them that I haven't discussed this with, and 3 of them that I definitely know they're able to follow this conversation and give nods to it. So they're more on the side of psychedelics are maybe a part of something that people have done for thousands of years. Psychedelic entheogenic experience, DMT, prophetic experience. So I think, and at least one of those people is from Israel, was born and raised in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm good. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear an opinion of somebody who I gave this book to as a gift, because he had actually for a period of time been a Hasidic, Orthodox. He'd been an Orthodox Hasidic Jewish person, practicing with that whole aspect of is it the law? We call it the law.
Well, Rabbinic Judaism requires adherence to certain precepts that regulate your daily life.
Yeah, so he was just doing orthodoxy for a bit, and now he's not. And I know him through Min's group, so we do a lot of communication in the Marshall Rosenberg style with nonviolent communication and compassionate listening. And then the other friend of mine, the other couple friends of mine, I think one is more like, gosh, I have trouble describing where she's at, but I want to say that she's more like Jewish upbringing and like almost pagan, almost pagan. But that might, I might not have really dived in with her, dove in and asked her like where her belief system lies. I know she practices things like ayahuasca and takes ayahuasca. And then, on this show, actually, twice this year, we've had a shamanic practitioner named Itzhak Biri, who's also published under the same publisher as you are with this DMT Soul of Prophecy. And he was raised in one of those Jewish communities. I forget that they're like rural communities in
A kibbutz.
kibbutz. Yeah, yeah. So I think he's a really kind soul, and he has a lot of compassion, and he practices his shamanic rituals with that in mind. But I don't know how deeply involved with modern Jewish mysticism he is. I know he lives in New York, and he travels around the world, and he often takes people to Peru and Bolivia and Brazil and stuff.
Yeah, there's somebody that comes to the States occasionally who's a Hasidic Jew and leads ayahuasca ceremonies.
Interesting. Very interesting. I mean, medicine for the people is medicine, and when it comes to communication with the all that is, the Great Spirit, in this case, Yahweh, Jehovah, I think let's do it. Let's talk. Let's figure this out, and maybe that'll help us to arrive in a place that is more appropriate as moderns.
Yeah, and the question always comes up about, did the Hebrews trip, or did Ezekiel take a mushroom, or was, Moses sleep deprived? Yeah, so, I don't think you need to, locate an exogenous, source of, say, DMT, because it's, made in, the mammalian brain. It's conceivable that, levels could get to a point on their own without outside stimulation from a plant or a fungus to change consciousness in a prophetic kind of way. The there's a number of stumbling blocks people come up with against the prophetic model that I'm talking about. One is that the source of information exists outside of yourself. That God and you are different, and even though you can come close, you can't really become one with or become, God. But you can, communicate. Just like we're communicating. You're there, I'm here, and we're talking. So that's a stumbling block for some people who believe it's all within, it's all projection, it's a mirror. I don't think that's the case with the traditional prophetic stream. The other is the question of the content of the prophetic stream. The history, as it were, that's being laid out in the text. And it's about the people Israel, beginning with Adam, obviously, but becoming more specifically, focused on Abraham as the first of the Hebrews, the first of the Jews. So what is what is the history? Well, if there's one thing that's also emphasized in the text, it's God's involvement with history. The Tower of the Tower of Babel the splitting of the Red Sea, the revelation on top of Mount Sinai. All of those are narratives of God's intervening in history. In other words, God is steering history in a particular direction, and then that gets particular and gets specific, and raises the whole issue of the role of the Hebrews, of the Jews, in the world, and that becomes contentious. So I think that's another reason that's the prophetic model may remain somewhat peripheral for a while, at least taken seriously.
Yes. So maybe we can speak directly, make commentary around some of the things that are touched on in this book and that maybe you've touched on in previous interviews. And I know that I've actually been seen and maybe even recorded around town. I want to say like evangelizing, but it's like the scene in the Hebrew Bible when we're up on Mount Sinai and Moses is converging on the burning bush and he has a vision, and there's a whole dialogue that occurs there. In some entheogenic circles, it's believed that he's tripping on whatever's burning there.
Yeah. There's an Israeli psychologist, Benny Shannon, who published a paper some years back on the burning bush, being a kind of acacia, and many of the acacias contain DMT. So the theory goes that the burning bush, Moses, was inhaling vaporized DMT. But even if that were true, there isn't any other evidence for any of the other people undergoing prophecy of a burning bush or smoking tryptamines. There's cannabis, which some are proposing is an ingredient in the incense that was burned in the Holy of Holies once a year, in which case the high priest could communicate with God. But that's one limited example too. Occurs one time a year in one person. There's the manna, which Dan Merker proposed was a kind of ergot fungus. But if you look at the level of prophecy of the whole Hebrew people in the desert, it was pretty low level as compared to the prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah. And there isn't any evidence that the canonical prophets who experienced full-blown, highly articulate, well characterized, experiences of the prophetic state. There's no evidence of them eating manna or any other outside substance.
So there's a scene, and I really appreciate you offering clarity on that and the whole manna thing. There's a scene that I think predates the in the timeline of the Moses and the Jews leaving Egypt, in which they supposedly are servants, and they're commanded to eat unleavened bread. And what if going back to entheogenic circles, what if within those entheogenic circles that I run in, that bread had ergotaloid fungus in it, and it was served, or not the unleavened bread, but the other bread that was served to the rest of the Egyptians at the time. Maybe the other Egyptians, including Pharaoh, were tripping, and it was rather easy for there to be an exodus.
Well, that is possible. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. The fact is, for whatever reason, Moses was able, to lead all of these, people out to the desert for the next, 40 years. The mechanisms are cool. Yeah, I mean, endless, gallons of ink have been spilled and will be spilled about the mechanisms. Was it this drug or that drug? Was it this plant or that plant? But it's the states that lead to information that I think is, the highlight of, approach to altered states that is more pragmatic. Like, what do you do with tripping? You know, what's in there that you can use both in your thinking and your behavior. So the states and what the chemicals are, those are kind of relevant, but what's important and endures and influences is the information.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. I, I'm I'm wondering if you're willing to talk about your novel, which was, I think its title is Levi something, because that might be a fun way to sort of end our I'm going to say seasonal holiday special.
Yeah, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. It's a autobiographical novel that came out in March. It's the account of an alter ego of mine, Joseph Levy.
Joseph. Okay.
To forestall any premature conclusions. I am a nicer guy than Joseph Levy, but Joseph Levy spends a year being sick and recuperating in a small Southwest town with limited medical proficiency, and he's in a bad mood most of the time. But there are flashes of hope and some wonderful people who pass through. Some real nutballs too. So it's a bit of a, well, it I think falls into a number of different categories. Medical humor, self-help. I throw in the Christian basis of anti-Semitism in there. So it's kind of wide-ranging. My two inspirations, or my two role models for writing fiction or that kind of fiction are Bukowski and P.K. Dick, Charles Bukowski and Philip Dick.
Yeah.
They can describe very strange scenes and just keep their wits about them. Dick is really good at introspection and free association and internal dialogue. There's a lot of internal monologue, I guess, in the Joseph Levy book. It's short, 220 pages, I think. It's a small book, 5x7, I think. So it's a quick read. Friends read it in 6 hours, or anybody can read it in 6 hours. But it's been getting good reviews and good blurbs. It's kind of hard, breaking into a completely different genre. I mean, it's been hard enough from the psychedelic, to the religious, but from nonfiction to fiction is even tougher.
Yeah, I mean, you're like a man of so many different mantles, and most of them have been, very nuanced, very rebellious, in some ways quite maverick. And I look forward to reading this Joseph Levy book. It's an autobiography, you said?
Well, it's what's referred to as autobiographical fiction.
Oh, fun. Okay. This could be really fun. I mean, it'll help me to clue in, because I've been following you a number of years. It'll help me to clue in as to who sits before me and what has become of all the experiences that led to this moment.
Yeah. One of the common refrains of the book, or from people that have read the book, is that the character lacks redemption. He's never redeemed, and he may be irredeemable.
Oh.
And I think that's an interesting observation, and it assumes a certain thing about fiction, and as a corollary about real life, is that there ought to be some redemption through suffering. But I mean, who says? I think it's as good as it gets sometimes to just observe and deal, and then tell a story, and then go on. So the whole idea of, well, it's not the character's not redeemed. He's not like more holy or working with the poor or starting an orphanage. Yeah, he just scrapes by, starts with a bad tooth, ends with a bad tooth, or a replacement for the second bad tooth. Yeah, so it's just kind of gritty, kind of weird. Small town Southwest. Lots of natives. Yeah, so it was. Well, it corresponds to a year of my poor health and recuperation. I got a lot of my PTSD worked out in the writing.
Very, very nice. Oh, that brings me full circle to something we did table, the near-death experience. And I'm sure you have a lot to say about this, and you're welcome to free associate. I totally, when I first got your original book, DMT and the Spirit Molecule, I went on a yoga teaching, like almost preacherly lecture series where I talked about all the different techniques that I knew within yoga, specifically pranayama, that would help us with preparation for death and dying. And you were this huge inspiration to me. And I love that word, inspiration, because of your willingness to put that out there as a connection to DMT, the idea that near death could be a place where we get more DMT experiences.
Yeah, well, we're kind of winding down, so maybe we could go into more detail maybe next time. But yeah, to the extent, well, my favorite mantra when people say, well, is DMT involved in this or that? My stock answer is, to the extent that the non-drug state resembles that brought on by giving DMT, it makes sense that there's some common biology.
Very, very nice. All right, so I can imagine that we could do a future show in which we get to fully investigate the near-death state, and maybe I'll even get to read in your novel.
Well, that was interesting. Like I was close to dying at a certain point. I was going into shock, or my character was, and I was expecting it, or the character was expecting it to be like a DMT experience, but instead, it was like the volume was being turned down, and the dimmer switch was being turned down. There weren't any fireworks or anything at all. So that was a bit. But still, it wasn't NDE. I mean, I was going into shock, but I hadn't flatlined or stopped breathing, or my heart stopped or anything. But at least the prelude was pretty ordinary.
Yes, I would agree. I've had the shock state, and I haven't had. Well, I guess I have had an NDE, but I was very young. So this is really fun. This has been Dr. Rick Strassman, and we've been discussing DMT and the soul of prophecy. If people wanted to reach out to you, I did want, when I was waiting for you to jump on the line here, I did a little bit of research on the Cottonwood Research Foundation. Are you still a part of that?
Yeah, but it's kind of hibernating right now. We were the fiscal sponsor for the DMT movie, or a fiscal sponsor. But there's all this good research going on that I think our vision, although it still hasn't been actualized, it's getting there. There's more research, there's more acceptance, there's more mainstreaming, there's more education. So I'm pretty busy, and the other two guys are pretty busy. So it's on hold for now. We're maintaining our non-profit, tax-deductible status. That's pretty easy at this point. But it's just waiting for, I don't know, an influx of a lot of money or some kind of inspiration.
Beautiful. Tell people how they can reach out to you, what we can expect from you, if you've got anything on the bill for 2020 that you're appearing as a speaker for, or that you're writing.
Let's see. Well, if people want to reach me and to buy a book from me, you can go to my website, rickstrassman.com. And I have a Facebook page. You can follow me there. What am I doing in 2020? Well, I've got a couple of more writing projects.
Nice.
Perhaps some more installments in the Joseph Levy saga. And I've been studying the character of Abraham in the Bible quite a lot for a number of years, and I'd like to try my hand at some biblical fiction, the life and times of Abraham.
Nice.
So I might be going to Europe in the summer, and there's at least one conference. I don't like to travel that much alone, and I'm alone right now, so I generally don't attend conferences and whatnot, but I may be in Europe in June.
Okay, very good. And I want to implore our listeners to check out rickstrassman.com. I think that's originally how we had an email conversation over 10 years ago. And you did write me back, and I really appreciate you being down to earth like that.
Sure. Well, it's a responsibility besides being, mostly fun to answer every email. I mean, if people make the effort, if people have questions, it isn't a small thing, to write a guy who's written about DMT. It's the least I could do.
Absolutely. Pick up a copy of DMT, The Soul, and The Soul of Prophecy with Park Street Press and Inner Traditions. You can find them on innertraditions.com and their catalog thereof. This has been an edition of Entheoradio. Our I want to call this our Hanukkah special. Are you gonna celebrate Hanukkah this year?
That's fine.
All right.
Wouldn't object.
All right, this is our Hanukkah special. I'll light a menorah, I think in a couple weeks, right? On the 22nd?
Let's see. First night is the 22nd, Sunday.
All right, I'll light a menorah and I'll think of us and all the wonderful things that the ancient peoples have been through and the visions thereof.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Trevor.
Have a good one, and you can listen to Entheoradio across all the podcast medias, including iTunes now, and find us on Facebook. Entheoradio is spelled ENTHEO Radio.